A or B?
The key factor in the decision was the feeling of betrayal.
Left or right?
I tried it their way, now I'm going to try it my way.
Yes or no?
That was probably the biggest decision I've ever taken. The final scene was Reacher bleeding to death on a filthy motel bathroom floor.
Welcome to The Art of Deciding with Bruce Whitfield.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of The Art of Deciding, the podcast where we ask people who spend their lives making big decisions to tell us a little of how they do it. What do they base those decisions on? How do they make the difficult ones? And what happens if they get it wrong? I'm Bruce Whitfield. I'm a financial journalist and a speaker, and I talk to decision makers for a living. The internet tells us we make about 35,000 decisions every day. I'm hoping that listening to our decision makers in this series talk about their art will help some of those choices feel a little bit easier for you. Let me take you back to Manchester in the UK in 1995. Granada Television, the company behind classics like The Jewel and the Crown, The Royal Family, Brideshead Revisited, Cracker, and of course Coronation Street. It's not doing well financially. Economies must be made, and that means jobs must go. One person being shown the door is a rather mouthy union rep called James Grant. James makes a decision. He doesn't follow the rest of his booted-out colleagues down to the job centre. Instead, he goes to W.H. Smith's in the Arndale Centre and buys some pads of paper and some pens. He begins writing, and he creates the character of Jack Reacher. And he becomes Lee Child, one of the most commercially successful writers of all time.
I'm really fascinated by this podcast. What actually is a decision? When you look back at your life, so much of it was just whimsical, accidental, instinctive, or whatever.
This probably comes under the category whatever. Who decides that their way out of a financial crisis is to become a writer?
That really was a tough decision because I was 39 and nearly 40, and I had a teenage daughter and I had a house and a mortgage and all that kind of thing. It was super high stakes. But to a certain extent, the decision was taken for me because that TV industry was now closed off to me because I'd also been the shop steward. So I was unemployable. There was no way that I was going to get a job in that business anymore. So what else? And I remember the key factor in the decision was the feeling of betrayal. If you work inside a management structure, in other words, if you've got a corporate thing above you, you are automatically insecure. So I wanted to do something on my own. You know, Reacher himself, paralleling my life, is downsized out of the US Army at the end of the Cold War. And there's a line in that first book. He says, I tried it their way, now I'm going to try it my way. And that was very much the basis of my decision. But ultra insecure, you've got to be a complete lunatic to say, look, I'm broke, I'm out of work, I've got a family to support. I know, I'll write a book.
Most people would go and look for more security and a huge vote of confidence in your belief that you could create somebody unique that people would follow. What gave you that confidence?
Well, it was difficult in terms of assessing. You know, if one assumes a good decision is based on grasping the full information and then acting upon it, that was all negative for me. I was hyper-trained and hyper-experienced in a job that no longer existed. Completely non-transferable skills. So effectively, I was 40, but I was the same as 20. I had nothing to offer. But then I thought, wait a minute, just take a step back, then take another step back. What do you see from the wider perspective? And I'd spent nearly 20 years intimately involved with audience, to the point where my success depended on feeling and knowing and understanding what an audience would like, what worked for them and what didn't. So they are a little bit transferable in terms of skills. So that gave me confidence to do it. That was immediately short-circuited by the understanding that, having worked so long in television, and you must know this, everybody in the business knows this, everything is really an accident. You can't ever really plan anything. And the number of times you've seen somebody plan a success, it fails because the planning somehow corrupts it. You end up with a shopping list of things you think you ought to have. So that, in a very circular way, my experience with the audience was teaching me you can't predict the audience. You just don't know. That led me to actually undertake the process in a way that was deliberately ignorant. I just closed my eyes to everything that I thought I knew, and I then just operated on gut instinct.
Did you have a time frame in mind? If you didn't have it nailed within a couple of months, you were going to run out of money. How did you sort of base that structured decision-making, if there was a structure at all, to say, I'll go waitering in month 6 if this doesn't come together?
Yeah, that was something that was on my mind, obviously. And it was a family decision, too, because there was more than me involved. We talked about it a lot because it was very high stakes. And we said, we'll give it a year. Not necessarily to have the book sold and published in a year, because that's a very compressed timescale, but to give ourselves a year to know, is it going to work or not, to make a better guess. I got some redundancy money, and by the time I'd paid off a couple of things, I had 7 months living money left, 7 mortgage payments, 7 months of groceries. Could I get it done in that time? And I did. I think I had probably about 4 weeks to spare when I got that first deal. But I do realize, looking back, the intensity and the energy that I brought to it, because that was the subconscious part, I think, the desperation, the feeling of no alternative. This had to work. And so looking back, I approached it with enormous passion, energy, anger, really, that I think informed a lot of the storyline and a lot of Reacher's character.
Now we know a bit more about the thinking behind Lee Child's extraordinary decision. Take a step back. I'll take another step back. I suppose he's saying, give yourself a different perspective, reframe how you see things. But then, you can't plan a success. He went for deliberately ignorant, fueled by a mixture of passion, instinct, and, anger. Maybe it's not a formula you'd find in the self-help books. The fact is, though, he did what he decided to do. Write a bestseller. That book was Killing Floor, the first in a series of now 29 Jack Reacher books, which have sold more than 100 million copies and counting, some of which were turned into a hit movie franchise, with Reacher played totally inappropriately by a not very big Tom Cruise, and a TV series as well. Lee Child created a character that spoke to people, that readers love. How did he do that? What choices did he make? First of all, he made him huge, tall, broad, long-armed and long-legged, with a thick neck and hands the size of dinner plates. It turns out that decision wasn't quite so arbitrary. Lee already had a hero that inspired him.
I had a Ladybird book about David and Goliath, a little thin thing, and it had fantastic pictures. And Goliath was this huge giant, and I loved him. And in that childish way, I'd be about 4, I think, I kept reading the book over and over again, hoping that one day Goliath would win. And he never did. That's clearly something in my mind, this different from somebody else's defect, maybe. I don't know what it is, but I just want overwhelming, magnificent victory. For instance, if I go and watch the football, I want to see the Villa win 9-0. That would give me 1,000 times more satisfaction than watching them a really exciting game that they win 4-3 or something like that, which is classically regarded as the better game because it's more exciting. So all those years later, I thought, can we have Goliath be the good guy? And I think, yeah, we can accept that. Classically, traditionally, you're supposed to put your hero in peril or in danger. Now, how do you put Goliath in danger? That was the technical challenge. Was it possible to make the reader worried about a person who was effectively invulnerable?
Why the focus on small town America? Could you make things up more easily? It's out of the public eye. I'd like to think I could, with a couple of weeks' notice, probably bang out a short story based in DC or New York. I've been there. I can kind of feel it. You chose small towns. Was that a deliberate evolution? Was it the plan from the beginning?
It was kind of defensive in as much as you say, New York, Washington, D.C., same thing with London. They are international properties, and everybody, at least in their mind, they have an idea of what they're like. But small town America is literally far away from anywhere else, so that it was a universe in which things could happen plausibly, or at least with that level of implausibility that a novel reader always gives you. They give you the one thing at the beginning. Okay, yeah, so Reacher's happened to stumble into this gigantic conspiracy. I did it because America is the bigger market.
Yeah.
I did it because I was sick of Britain because of having just been fired by this new environment that we were in. I wanted to escape, at least in my head, if I couldn't do it physically yet. And so writing about America was obvious on so many different levels, including the fact that even though I knew America pretty well by that point, I would still have to pay attention to every single thing. If I was writing about Manchester, I would be constantly yo-yoing between what I knew and what I was making up. But writing about America, every single word, is it the correct word? Is the sentence got the correct rhythm? Is the slang right? Are the nuances right? Quite apart from are the facts right? It made it a job where I concentrated uniformly on everything. There was no period of relaxing.
Lee Child is now an author whose existence depends on his ability to keep on writing stories that grip his readers. And storytelling is probably one of the most intense forms of decision-making that there is. Every single word is a tiny decision in itself. How does that work?
I'm not one of these guys that has a shoebox full of index cards with potential scenes or ideas on. I don't map anything out. I don't pin things up around the room in a sequence. None of that. I just start with the first sentence and hope it's a good one, and then sit there, scratch my head thinking, okay, what would be a good second sentence? And in my opinion, it suits me. That's a good decision on my part because it does open up random directions that you can go in. Because if you think about it, a book starts out with an infinite spread of possibilities. Anything could possibly happen. And then as soon as you define the first paragraph, you've narrowed it down drastically. And everything else you do narrows it further, step by step by step, until there's really only one place to go. There's a writing phrase that says, the ending must be both inevitable and surprising. And so the whole point is to somehow end up there. What I live for is the excitement of the story. But for me, it's always just a question of, if I was reading this book, I would be excited as to what happened next, and I would want some little thing to happen on the next page. And so I put it in as the writer. It's like building a bridge while walking across it. That would be the best way of describing it, that you are staring into the void. You've got to put the next little 6 feet of bridge in front of you, and you step onto that and then do it again and again and again. It feels like a high wire act, although the stakes are not high. You know, if you turn in a bad book with a huge hole in the plot, they don't send you to prison. So you have the joy of doing something that is potentially going to work and be lovely. But if it doesn't, you know, nobody comes and shoots you in the head. With Reacher, the idea was that he should just randomly react to each circumstance as it comes along. That's part of his situation. He does not have a fixed life with a structure to it. So everything is a random reaction as we go through. And it becomes a bit like pinball, that the story will bounce from one place to another. And if you were to put an outline ahead of time, I feel it narrows the choices down unrealistically. Early in that first book, there's a fight in a prison cell.
Yes.
Where Reacher then takes the glasses from one of the assailants. And I remember doing that so well. That was just to fill a paragraph. And then much later, I realized, wait a minute, I could use that as a crucial clue, which I did. And so I feel like if I'd been working to an outline, it shuts your brain down a little bit. It takes away the spontaneous left and right stuff that you can do that, first of all, gives the book a lot of flavor, but secondly, can add to the story later in a completely organic way.
The faith you have in yourself to allow the narrative to unfold in an original and authentic way is probably the boldest decision of all, the decision to not make a decision up front.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because, you know, I'm coming on this podcast about the art of deciding. And my message is really so much of it wasn't decided. It was going with the flow. It was instinctive. It was trusting a fleeting judgment. And but it seems to have turned out all right. And here's a thought about, for instance, artificial intelligence that we're getting hit by an awful lot at the moment.
Yeah.
Artificial intelligence is a bit of a sexy name for something that's quite boring. It's really just machine learning. In other words, if I were to say to one of these AI things, write me a Reacher novel in the style of Lee Child, the machine can look at everything that has been done already, and it will do it in a fraction of a second, and it will synthesize it into a version of what has been done already. But it can't do the new stuff. Instinctively, I felt, be open to the new stuff. If there's something you just feel in the moment, like a sentence you feel like writing that's going to take the book into a different direction, do it, because your subconscious is valuable here.
How do you know when a character has run his course? Because you got to a point not so long ago where you went, oh, that joy, you were possibly happy to be interrupted, happy to move house, happy to pack a box, happy to be called out. What were you contemplating as you came to that realization that perhaps your relationship with Jack Reacher had reached its time?
I mean, that is the fundamental question for me about deciding, because that was probably the biggest decision I've ever taken. First of all, the character of Reacher, we will never be sick of him because Reacher is merely this era's version of a character that's been around literally forever. You go back to the Westerns, the Western characters were themselves imports from medieval Europe, who were versions of Scandinavian sagas, who were versions of Anglo-Saxon battle poems and Greek myths. You could even say religious myths, the arrival of a savior, the knight errant who would show up unexplained, do the good thing, and then ride off into the sunset. The idea of getting tired of Reacher is not possible. He will be reinvented for the next several thousand years.
Yes.
It was the writer that I had to think about. And that was based on reading as a kid. I hated it when you would be into an author or into a series and you got like the 8th or the 10th installment and the author was now lazy, bored, phoning it in, probably retired to Switzerland as a tax exile and drunk all the time or whatever. And it was such a betrayal to my young self as a reader. I hated it. So when I started, I made myself a promise that if I ever sensed that I was going to run out of gas, I would stop. The last book I wrote all by myself was the 24th, called Blue Moon. And I remember 2 days in that process where I thought, I don't want to do this today. And I took that as a really bad sign. I thought, this is the early warning system. So from that point on, to honor the promise I'd made, I thought, I must give up. I must stop because it's going to get worse.
As Lee said, the biggest decision he's ever taken. What are the options?
I started out assuming I would kill him, some kind of noble death. Let's have him protecting some other person, and he's backed into a situation where he can't have both of them survive. So naturally, Reacher gives himself up. I even had a title for the book. It was going to be called Die Lonely. And the final scene was going to be Reacher bleeding to death on a filthy motel bathroom floor. I'd become aware not only that the books were popular and selling well, but the connection between the character and the reader was so emotional. People really liked this guy, and I felt that would be gratuitously cruel to the reader. So then I developed a metaphorical version of that, where Reacher does the normal thing, solves the problem, heads off to the bus depot, and halfway there he thinks, you know what, I kind of like it here. Maybe I'll adopt a dog and rent a house. And that would have been the metaphorical death of Reacher. But still, the readers wanted more. And that feels like a big responsibility, that they have done you the enormous compliment of liking your work. So I felt it wasn't really about just me. It's selfish to say, yeah, you like my work, but I'm old and tired now, so forget it. That felt too one way as a decision. In the end, the solution was staring me in the face, which was my brother, who is also a thriller writer and very much younger than me. He is very like me, even though there is this monster age difference. If I was kidnapped in Ruritania and thrown into a dungeon, and I managed to grab a cell phone, and I had 1 second to text one word to one person, I would text it to Andrew, because I could trust him to figure it out and do something about it. So I would text the word, I'd sit there, and sure enough, 2 or 3 days later, Andrew would come and rescue me, because we were absolutely on the same wavelength. One word is enough for him. So I was idly daydreaming about, wouldn't it be great if I could go down to the crossroads at midnight and do a deal with the devil where he gave me back all that energy and stamina and ideas that I had 15 years ago, which was a daydream, because obviously you can't do that. But then I thought, wait a minute, you idiot. You know a person who is you 15 years ago with all that passion and energy and stamina. You know a person like that. So I felt this could work. And I asked him to do it. I was assuming he would say no, because he was doing his own stuff and he's a very stubborn and independent boy. But he said, yeah.
How do you collaborate? Do you allow him now to take ownership? Do you step back from it completely? It still has your name in bigger letters on the cover, after all.
That is to be expected, I think, in terms of the commercial aspect. But yeah, I totally step back. And people imagine that that's hard, handing over the character. Same thing with the TV and the movies that we did. Is it hard handing it over to them? And no, it's not. It's the entire point of doing this, that you're doing this purely to hand it over to somebody else. That somebody else being the reader initially. You want the reader to take ownership of it. You want the reader to claim the character and ignore the author. Like Sherlock Holmes or James Bond. Yeah. They belong to the world. And so the act of handing it over is an affirmation. It's a happy thing. It's what you want.
I'm assuming best decision ever, creating Jack Reacher. Can we agree on that one?
Yeah, best decision ever was not being timid in that period, because I know you're going to ask me, what is my worst decision ever? And if I look back at that, I would have to say it's probably something that involved being timid. And so I was aware it was make or break. You're 40 years old. You're halfway through your working life. Don't settle. Don't be scared. Don't look for the safe option. At least try something bold. Because if I do look back to worst decisions, I mean, really, what is a decision? It's so hard to define. There was one occasion, our daughter was less than a year old and we needed to move house. And so we looked at a couple of places, and one was £10,000 more than the other one. I mean, this is how long ago this was. One house was 27,000 and one house was 37,000.
It's significant.
Yeah, it's a big percentage. And I don't know, I retreated into caution and comfort and bought the cheaper one, which a financial analyst looking back would now say crippled me the rest of my life. You know, I missed out on that escalator at the beginning of the 1980s. And I was theoretically perpetually behind the curve thereafter. And I so remember making that decision out of being cautious, sensible, fundamentally timid. So the next big decision I had was the end of that career, like we've talked about. And I was determined to be realistic, but not timid.
Realistic, but not timid. Lee Child's Art of Deciding. His realistic boldness has led to one of the most commercially successful writing careers ever. There's a brand new Jack Reacher book written by Andrew, and now we know why, that has just come out. October 2024. In Too Deep. What a decision that was. To hand over your own creation, one of the most iconic fictional heroes ever, to someone else. Lee can explain it, as he says he wants to hand Reacher over for him to become the reader's property. But how many of us could say that we would do the same? How many people do we know in families, in business, in politics, in life, who would have been wiser and happier if they'd been as true to their principles as Lee Child and the promise he made to himself? Thank you for listening to this episode of The Art of Deciding, the podcast where we ask people who make big decisions to reveal a little of how they do it. You'll find us on all major podcast platforms, so please follow so that you don't miss an episode. We have some fascinating decision makers in this series, from beauty and tech entrepreneur Sharmadean Reed to Lord Karen Billamoria, the founder of Cobra Beer, who talks about serendipity and sliding doors and the role of chance in decision making. I'm Bruce Whitfield. I talk to decision makers for a living. Their lessons can help you make better decisions. You can find out more about me at brucewhitfield.com. Till next time. Bye-bye.